All right, so we're joined tonight by Andrew Simpson, Dr. Andrew Simpson.
Andrew will do.
Now, I've done some work with Andrew through the EVIE networks, like promoting that charging company. And I'll just read through his bio that's on the EVIE website just to give you a little bit of background. But Andrew's one of Australia's leading experts on electric vehicles and charging systems with 20 years of deep experience within the electric mobility and renewable energy sectors. Prior to joining EVIE Networks, he was the Managing Director of Verdant Vision, providing strategic planning and implementation support to electric fleets and charging networks throughout Asia Pacific, with clients such as Air New Zealand and Asian Development Bank. Dr. Simpson, or Andrew, has also contributed to EVIE. Which one? I have three. Oh God, which one's the last? This one. Well, it's on. Is it just poorer quality? I don't know. I'll continue on. Okay. We'll do what we did before. Is that any better? Someone say yes, no on the stream. Yeah. So Andrew has also contributed to EVIE policy for APEC Standards Australia and multiple levels of government in Australia, New Zealand and USA. Andrew began his career at the world famous National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Denver, Colorado, and he's also an early Tesla employee, helping to bring the Roadster to market and pave the way for their Model S and supercharger network. So quite a vast array of EV, coming through the years of EVs, and I wanted to start this conversation with a bit of a reminiscing of what it was like. I had a bit of a look at some of the stuff online, and you did the presentation at the 2018 AEVA Expo, and you gave a bit of a rundown of stuff that you had been involved with. One of those was the Sunshark solar car while you were a uni student. So that was your degree. Mm-hmm. So that was in engineering. Mm-hmm. Is everyone familiar with the race that they hold, and you have to? You tell us.
I can tell the story.
Yeah. So essentially, there's the fastest time. Is it using energy? Like, you just maybe elaborate on what the conditions are to win the race.
Yeah, so the event that John's talking about is called the World Solar Challenge. It's been running, since the late 1980s, actually was the first one. And the aim of the game is simply to get from Darwin to Adelaide as fast as possible, only using the power of the sun. And that challenge hasn't changed in the entirety of the event. What has changed over time is the restrictions around the design of the cars, because they keep getting better and faster, so they have to keep reining them in. But for me, this is actually going back almost 25 years to the University of Queensland's team, which first raced in 1996. I didn't actually join the team until 1997, which was the second year of my undergraduate degree. But then, for the remainder of my undergraduate degree, I basically spent the whole time in the lab working on the car rather than studying, but managed to do okay anyway, because it's a pretty good way to learn.
Yeah, so what sort of stuff did you have to do?
Yeah, so we were a student team, so we designed and built a solar car from scratch. It had a solar array that was around about 1,000 watts in peak output, which is kind of like a small toaster, if you want to think of it that way. But on that very small amount of power, it could do 80 kilometres continuously and never stop. In terms of efficiency, that's around about 12 watt hours per kilometre, so that's about 1/10.
12 watt hours, yeah.
Yeah, 1/10 of what the best production EVs today are achieving. So really, really efficient. And with our solar array, we could cruise all day at pretty decent highway speeds. We also had a battery pack to buffer us. The vehicle was a hybrid, actually, in the strictest sense of the word. So there was a 5 kilowatt hour battery in there to buffer you when the sun was behind a cloud or when you're going up a hill and so forth. But we would do the trip from Darwin to Adelaide in 5 days. And the world record nowadays, I think, is closer to 3. So, things have come a long way. But one thing I know you're keen on, John, is, what was the technology like back then? Very much motorsport grade. Everything was lightweight, as cheap as possible. It was designed to last one race, and it would tend to blow up shortly, not long after. One of the key things we did that we like to brag about back then was we actually used lithium-ion batteries. We were one of the very first automotive applications of lithium-ion batteries in the world. We were using military-grade cells. They weren't very robust, but they worked for one race. They performed quite well. But back in those days, the term BMS, which today we call a battery management system, back then it was a battery monitoring system. And that's important because we could sort of see what was happening inside the pack, but we couldn't do anything about it. And to the point where we actually set fire one once in the lab when the monitoring system was working, but we weren't paying attention. So yeah, batteries have come a very long way in cost and reliability, but even back then lithium was clearly the technology of choice. The other thing I need to mention though is the power electronics, particularly the motor drive inverter. So we had a three-phase brushless DC motor with a three-phase power electronic inverter driving that, and it was designed by the founders of Tritium. So the 3 founders of Tritium, Dave, Paul and James, mates of mine since back then, they were the electronics team and they designed that first motor drive inverter. Now, when we come back to talking about charging infrastructure in a moment, you'll be surprised to learn that the guts of a Tritium 50 kilowatt charger are basically exactly the same as that motor drive inverter from 20 years ago. So, it's a small world.
So you mentioned 5 kilowatt hour battery, and 25 years ago, do you remember how much that would have cost?
40,000 comes to mind.
40,000, okay. So 8,000 a kilowatt hour?
Yeah, in dollar terms back then as well.
Prior to the inflation that we've had, so okay. But now I think we're probably looking more between $500 and $1,000 a kilowatt hour. But even less. So for laymen, maybe that much. But okay, there was a quick little stat that I wanted to just give about the Sun Chart, and that's that it covered 3,010 kilometres for the race in 41 hours at an average speed of 72.5 kilometres an hour. So not being that familiar with the race, like someone's in the car that whole time, day and night, or just during the day and then
just during the day,
to until it stops, or
so the race rules where you could race from sunrise to sunset. And when you weren't on the road, you were allowed to sit at the side of the road and charge if you wanted instead. But we had a couple of drivers. They were small, skinny, lightweight people, tended to be girls because they fit better, and we would rotate through shifts. So yeah, just a couple of specialist drivers. Probably 4 hours at a time. Yeah, there were a few road rules that we sort of ignored back then.
As long as your bladder could hold.
Yeah, as long as your bladder could hold. And there was a strategic plastic water bottle in the car just in case.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so in 2003, as part of your PhD, you worked on the design study for the Ultra Commuter. I hadn't heard of this. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that project's kind of disappeared in history, but it was really important because it was, to our knowledge, one of the first real-world applications of solar car technology and what became electric vehicle technology. So the whole idea of the Ultra Commuter, which was, and the project was conceived around the year 2000, was to take everything we'd learned about racing a solar-powered car and put it in a real car. So we still had the same lithium-ion batteries, the same solar panels, the same carbon composite construction, the same brushless DC motors, but just a car that looked more realistic. And the target for efficiency of that vehicle was 50 watt-hours per kilometre. So about 4 times the consumption of the solar car, but again, less than half of what today's EVs are achieving. It was a 2-seater. It was designed to have, decent performance, 0 to 107 or 8 seconds, something like that. The battery was about 10 kilowatt hours, and from that we were expecting to get a range of, 150 to 200 kilometres on a charge. But the more important thing was that the car was covered in solar panels on the roof, like built into the composite exterior. And in Queensland in particular, that solar array was enough to generate 30 to 40 kilometres of travel every single day on average. So it was actually a solar powered car for the real world. That never went into production, even though at the time we were talking about it, but it did get built. It actually got built in the end by a university in New Zealand, and it got raced in the World Solar Challenge about 10 years ago. So it worked, and the performance was pretty close to what we predicted. But I think, that the translation of solar car technology into the real world was the key thing. And what most people don't know, actually, is that the solar car racing teams from back in those days, the late 80s, the 90s, actually gave rise to most of the electric vehicle companies that we're aware of today. So, I've told you about Tritium, but a better example is Tesla. So the core engineering team at Tesla, which we'll talk about in a moment, were predominantly Stanford University students who'd race solar cars. We actually beat them, but they founded Tesla, so good for them. But another example is Fleet Karma. So Mark and Nathan talked about the vehicle monitoring program that's underway right now. That Canadian company, Fleet Karma, was founded by the solar car team from the University of Waterloo in Canada, and we raced against them too. And then the final one, which is the one that impresses me the most, is back in 1987, the very first World Solar Challenge. General Motors put a car in. They were the only car. And it was pretty good. It wasn't as fast as ours, but this is 10 years prior to us. The guys who built the GM Sunraiser in 1987 then worked on the GM EVIE in the 1990s, and then many of those guys actually then joined us at Tesla in the 2000s as well. So a lot of the talent and a lot of the tech that you're seeing in your car today, you can trace all the way back to those solar cars that raced across the Australian desert in the late 80s and 90s. It's really cool.
Yeah. And I guess, is it the Lightyear 1 that has just about reached production in England? Is it the Lightyear 1?
Yeah,
it's now you're seeing cars with integrated solar on them that are like a production car. So I would say you must be almost able to track that back to the same.
Probably, yeah. There'll be a solar car team behind it.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. All right. So you've mentioned a couple of times that you did work for Tesla. So perhaps you could. And so was that you in the Roadster driving across the Bay Bridge? That was you. Okay.
Yep.
So what year was that? Was that
That would have been 2007.
2007? You were driving a Roadster. Okay.
Yep.
That's pretty impressive. Okay. So maybe explain. You've gone to America. What the reason for that was? Did you get a job at Tesla and that's why you went there? Or?
No, I was already there.
You were already there, okay. And yeah, just what it was like in the very early days of the Tesla company.
Yeah, so having done that ultra commuter concept car, there was no jobs in Australia, so I looked for work and found a role in North America, actually at a government lab over there, so equivalent to CSIRO. They had this lab in Denver called the National Renewable Energy Lab. They had a team that was specialising in plug-in hybrid vehicles at the time. EVs weren't quite good enough yet, so plug-in hybrids and hybrids were all the rage. So that was good. I got a foot in the door in the States, got to work with GM, Ford and Chrysler at the time on their hybrids, including the Volt, for example. But eventually I asked them if they would be willing to help me with my residency in the States, get a green card and that sort of thing, and they were like, no, we're a government lab, we can't employ foreigners on a permanent basis, so sorry, can't help you. So I said, all right, I'm out of here. Resigned on the spot basically, but just total coincidence at that time in 2006, Tesla came out of stealth mode. So they'd already been in business for about 3 years. I had actually seen a prototype Tesla years before in somebody's garage without realising what I was looking at the time. But yeah, so
was it a Lotus?
It was actually it was a car called before that it was a car called the T0. Has anyone in the room heard of the T0? Yeah. So the T0 was an electric sports car, two-seater with lead acid batteries. So in 2003...
Was it based on a model in particular?
No, it was custom built. It was a special car. It was the fastest EV in the world at that time. If you read the books about Elon and the like, you can see some snippets of this. So the story goes that Martin and Mark, when they founded Tesla, needed to do a proof of concept. They had this idea of using the 18650 cells. They needed to prove it could be done in a car. So they actually got a bit of money. I don't know if Elon was involved yet, by the way, but however they got that initial money, they commissioned this crew down in Los Angeles to build a T0, but they replaced all the large loads of batteries like that one with big blocks of 18650 cells. And so in 2003, I was over there for a conference and I saw the prototype being built in their workshop. And I was like, well, that's cool, but I didn't know what it was for, who was behind it. 3 years later, I found out. So Tesla came out of stealth mode in 2006. I cold called them. They basically offered me a job on the spot, again because of the solar car credentials, because it was a bit of a fraternity. And I changed all my plans, left Denver, went to California, and the rest is history. But at that time in 2006, Tesla was pretty well funded already. They'd already done all their engineering with Lotus in England. They had the Lotus factory lined up, ready to start production. They had their motors, they had their batteries, they had all of the bones of the product, but they hadn't built one yet. So when I started in 2006, they shortly thereafter took delivery of the very first prototype out of the Lotus factory in England. It came across on the boat. There was actually 2 of them. They came across on the boat to California, arrived at the office, and my boss, the CTO, said, "All right, Andrew, here's the keys. Go tell me if the bloody thing works or not."
Wow.
So that was pretty cool. That was a real honour. So I got to do the first testing of the first roadsters, and unfortunately it didn't work anywhere near the way it was supposed to. The range was not good. The acceleration was even worse. At the time we were targeting, I think, 250 miles was the claim for range, so 400 kilometres. That car that I first tested was lucky to do 300. It came in at sort of the high 200 kilometre range. And the acceleration wasn't good either. There were other issues. So for the first year or so, lots of testing of the Roadster with me behind the wheel a lot of the time. I had a very sore bum that year. But you know, the car just went through subsequent iterations over the course of the year. There was production version that finally came out, the Roadster 1.0, then there was the Roadster 1.5, had a different transmission, then there was the Roadster 2.0 that had a different motor. Then we got rid of the transmission and went back to a single gear. So, you know, over a couple of iterations, the roads got better and better and better. And eventually we got almost to 400 k's. We got to 244 miles instead of 250. But we did get the performance. So we got the 0 to 60 mile per hour time down to the 3.7 seconds that it was supposed to be. We got the top speed up. And yeah, the car came to market. And, you know, was a real game changer. So that was my first year there, but then I had a second year there, and that then was all about the Model S. So even back then, Tesla was planning the Model S, the Model 3. They didn't call them then in those days, but they were all part of the master plan. So all the work we'd done on the Roadster was basically turned into a simulation model that would allow us to design the architecture for the Model S. So in my second year at Tesla, I designed the architecture for the Model S, like the powertrain architecture. So the battery sizes, motor sizes, range predictions, performance predictions, all of that was done as of 2007. Then they spent another 5 years figuring out how to actually make it at the right price.
So what was the very first Model S battery size, about 65 or 70?
Well, it was always planned to have a couple of variants. There was going to be a couple of variants of batteries and a couple of variants of motors, and I cannot for the life of me think what they were, but yeah, that was key. Look, I can't tell the story in full without also pointing to this lady over here. She's my wife, but she actually was a Tesla employee before she became my wife. We met around the same time we started in 2006. So our Tesla story is very shared. So
Right.
Alina certainly contributed a lot. You'll have to interview her another time because she knows way more about Elon than I do.
Okay. All right, so I just thought that was maybe some interesting backstory to introduce you, but the main reason you're here at the moment is because of the work you're doing with EV networks. So did you help with the infrastructure for charging for Tesla at all? So how did you transition from your Tesla employment to your EV network position?
Yeah, so that's somewhat circuitous, that path, but what happened is I was consulting in Australia from 2010 onwards, just about EVs generally, not just Australia, I should say throughout the Asia Pacific. So consulting to markets and governments about how to prepare. And obviously one of the things you need to do to prepare is work on infrastructure. So I got a lot of exposure to infrastructure planning and policy through that consulting work. But it wasn't actually until early 2018 when I decided I wanted to get into the game of actually building charging infrastructure. And again, it was a confluence of things. By this stage, Tritium was really kicking goals. The RT charger was selling very well globally. That's the 50 kilowatt charger.
Yep.
The 350 kilowatt charger, the PK, was already under development with first customers. So I knew, all about that and what they were up to. But I think what really tipped it, actually, and I need to point out Tim Harrison this time. this is true. It's all true story.
The whole audience gets a turn.
Tim Harrison was at that stage working for the Queensland government, planning the Queensland Electric Superhighway, and if memory serves me correctly, that was launched.
Oh.
Tap, tap, tap.
It's like
Testing, 1, 2.
just the red button, just the white button on the wall with the red light, mate.
Testing, there we go. So the Queensland Electric Superhighway, which Tim planned, launched in early 2018. Now, Alina and I already owned the Mitsubishi i-MiEV at that point, and it was like our EV universe just expanded overnight, because all of a sudden we could charge at all these new places, we could charge quickly. It completely changed the game for us. So I got in the car, and I wasn't working at the time otherwise, so I spent a couple of weeks driving all over southeast Queensland, seeing if Tim's network worked well. It was okay, I'll give it a pass. There were some issues, but
So could you make it between the charges? That's the question.
not all of them, which was one of the insights that came from that work. But look, I connected with Tim. We talked all about the pros and cons of that network plan. I was talking to Tritium at that time as well. And then next thing I know, a contact of mine from Silicon Valley, coincidentally, was now in Australia, and he was actually the founding CEO of the company that was called Fast Cities at that time. Fast Cities was already in business in early 2018, and they were planning to do a national network of ultra-fast chargers using the Tritium solution, complementing the 50 kilowatt networks that Tim and others were already building. So basically, again, called them up and basically got a job on the spot and set about planning to actually build the network and raise the money to do so.
Okay. All right, excellent. So the need for EV infrastructure, in particular DC fast and ultra fast charging infrastructure, became realised over the last couple of years with the release of EVs like the Ioniq, the Kona, the Model 3, the iBase. So people are really starting to use that network. Can you take us through some of the process of inventing what will become a network that will allow EVs to travel from Brisbane to Adelaide with the availability to charge at speeds that are only limited by the EV rather than the charger?
Yeah, so at the time in early 2018, Tritium had the 350 kilowatt products almost ready for market, and they had their first customer, which was Ionity in Europe, who are funded actually by the car companies in Europe. building a network for themselves, kind of like Tesla does globally. So we had this sort of template for what they were doing at the European sites, and we said, all right, we'll take that site template and we'll redeploy it in Australia. So I didn't really have to figure out how to design the charger or how to design the site. A lot of that work was done, but we did have to figure out how to provide coverage in a place like Australia. Yeah.
Locations.
Yeah, where are you going to put the sites? How far apart do you want to space them? How many chargers do you want to have at each site? How are you going to get the power to them? Because the Australian grid's nothing like the European grid. So a bunch of those things. And then the final piece was how much is it all going to cost? And that ended up being the governing factor. So we had early discussions with the federal government, with ARENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, the CEFC, which is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We talked to all of them, and out of all those discussions came this magical number of $50 million. That was kind of the maximum that anybody was willing to agree could be raised through private capital, through government subsidies and the like. So we're like, okay, we've got $50 million, what can we do with $50 million? And the answer was 42. Yeah, good. Some people got the joke. The answer happened to be 42. So we concluded we could build 42 sites similar to the EVIE sites. We could build 42 sites for $50 million. And so then it became just a game of, all right, where's the right places to put 42 sites to give the best result? And we obviously had to plan around networks like Tim's, so we weren't going to start duplicating his locations in Queensland. We knew the NRMA were doing things, we knew ChargeFox were doing things, we knew Tesla were doing things, so we had all these other people building networks too. We sort of had to, mould our plans around them. But yeah, in a nutshell, it was, what's the best way to spend $50 million to get as many 350 kilowatt charging sites across Australia as you can. And we targeted routes that are known to have high traffic because we knew the business wouldn't stack up unless we had good utilisation. So we targeted the Hume Highway, the Bruce Highway, the Pacific Highway, the road to Adelaide, some of the major tourism routes in Tassie and WA, and that was 42.
Yep. And that goes on quite well into the next question. And that's, you have the NRMA, the ChargeFox, and the question, like what was your transactions like with them like? Was it quite collaborative, or was it a bit of a, I'm not telling you where my site's going in, but it's going to be around here? Or, because from the expos that I've seen and talking to people that, like announcements that the network was going to be interleafed, so that you didn't just have one city with 3 different brand chargers and then nothing in the next city. So what was that process of collaboration or hostility?
It was in between that, I would say. There was definitely collaboration, but there was some competitive tension as well. What was easy for us was to discern the plans of the government networks, like the Queensland network. Tesla were pretty open about what they were doing. NRMA were a little bit more cagey, but it was pretty clear that they were just going to join the dots on the map. So we just really needed to find our sweet spot. The thing that made it a little easier for us, honestly, was when ChargeFox, when it became apparent that ChargeFox was going to sort of mimic the Tesla network to a large extent. And that's fine, I had no issue with that. Obviously, the other drivers of other brands needed coverage, so why not just copy Tesla? That's a great rationale. But we looked at that network plan and realised that we could easily put 42 sites in along similar routes, but with interleaving as you described it. And the only other thing we tried to do was we tried to avoid adding more sites where we thought the 50 kilowatt network was going to be sufficient. So, there's stretches of the Bruce Highway where we don't intend to deploy 350s because we don't think it's needed. Similar, Western Queensland, Western New South Wales, regional Victoria, there's large parts of the country where we just can't see a compelling need for those higher power chargers anytime soon, so we're not going to do it for the time being.
Okay. All right, so you get $50 million in funding, and we finally get to the point where the Coochin Creek charger is built. So that was a first on quite a few levels. It was the first PK to have both the Charter Mode and the CCS2. Obviously it had the large solar array, and it was your business's first actual charging stop. So what were the lessons that you learned from that build?
I think overall it takes a really long time was the biggest lesson. So Commuter Creek took a year and a half to light up, and at that particular location we had a really helpful landlord. He was super keen from day one, so negotiating.
What was that?
He was a friend of a friend of a friend of somebody at Tritium. But he'd always seen himself as, being a good location for a charging station, knowing that in 10 years' time that would be worth something. Yeah. So he was always keen, but getting the design done, the Energex application done, other consents, working with Tritium on lead times, other suppliers, it took a year and a half, and that's actually not unusual for sites. They do take a long time. So it takes a long time. That was the main lesson. The second biggest lesson is how expensive it can be. Because Commuter Creek was our first site, we kind of went all out. Greenfield site, brand new parking, brand new roadways to get to the parking, nice shiny solar canopy, full-size site, future-proof for 6 chargers. We bet no expense on Commuter Creek, and the dollars really added up. In terms of what we've changed going forward, we've certainly learned some lessons about doing a high voltage connection rather than a low voltage connection. So just to put that in numbers, your standard low voltage distribution throughout Australia is 400 or 415 volts phase to phase. That's common. A high voltage connection for us would be at 11 kV or 22 kV rather than the 415 or 400. And it's just a pain in the butt to do high voltage connections in Australia. They just make every aspect really hard and really expensive. So we inherited that sort of high voltage connection originally from what Ionity was doing in Europe, but we've decided that's probably not the way we're going to go. And we're pretty similar to Tesla and ChargeFox in that regard as well. That's one of the biggest learnings, is that it's probably better in Australia to go with low voltage, even though low voltage has less power in the long run, right, for these high-powered sites. It's just too hard to do it the other way. What have we retained? I think the biggest thing we learned and have retained going forward is that you've really got to take the time to find good quality sites and spend the money on making sure that they deliver a great service to the customer. The last thing you want is somebody pulling up for a charge, but then saying, oh, this doesn't work, or it's too hard to use, or I'm getting soaked in the rain. Like, there's a million ways charging can become an unpleasant experience. We've learned that you really do need to take the time and spend the money to try and make it as good as you can. So one of the reasons why our sites are taking longer than some of the other networks is we really have quite stringent criteria for selecting the sites and selecting the partner that's hosting us, and then criteria for design as well, that we're really trying to hold the line. So we look forward to having more sites out there, because we think people are going to be really pleased with the quality of the sites when they're done.
Yeah. All right, so just a follow-up question. So are you changing your overall strategy from high voltage, so 11,000 volt to more 415 volt?
Generally.
So if that's the case, then was the original plan to perhaps have like 6 head sites, and then now the plan's maybe not to have that type of situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you can do a 6 head site at low voltage or high voltage. Both are feasible.
But do you have to share? Do you have to share if there's 6 cars there at once?
You have to share either way. You're always sharing with somebody on the power grid. It really just boils down to who pays for the transformer and what are the tariffs. So if you go in at low voltage, Energex pays for the transformer, but then the tariffs are worse in return. So it's all trade-offs. But just in terms of ease of doing it and avoiding unnecessary delay and unnecessary risk, it's easy to go with low voltage. But the point I'm making is that in future, if we're trying to do electric truck stops for electric semi-trailers or something, there's going to be a limit on the low voltage network. At some point you're going to need to kick it up a gear, but for now we're okay.
Okay. So at the 2019 Expo that you announced, you said 42, but I've only counted 41.
42.
It's 42? I'm sure there is. So we've got that. We've got one in Townsville now. We've got one at Coocham Creek. There's two in New South Wales, one in Victoria, one in Campbelltown, Tasmania. Just opened this week, was it, or last week?
This week.
This week, excellent. So of the 42 charges, when would you say you could possibly be looking at, say, 75% completion for your whole network?
Yeah, I think at the moment we're tracking to have 75% done around the end of 2021. Okay. So in a year and a half or so from now. We've got a really strong pipeline of sites. We know where pretty much all of them are going to be. We know who the partner is. We've got the deal done. Yeah. Sometimes we're just being held up by the network connection process or something like that. So the pipeline's really solid, and through this year, not only will be, this calendar year, I think we'll easily get to double figures by the end of the year. But the other thing is we'll be announcing more of those partnerships with brand partners. So we've already made announcements with Caltex and their associated brands that are on a Caltex site, like the Foodery and some of those other food places. Puma, similarly, we've done a partnership announcement with them through the Townsville site. But there's others, and we're not just working with fuel retail, we're working with all those other usual suspect convenience brands that you might drive past on a highway to either fill up or have a snack. So that's really important, and that's another reason why some of our sites are taking longer, is because they're going to pop out in batches with these partners. The whole project, the full 42 sites, are due to be completed in 2022. COVID's introduced some risk, so we're sort of renegotiating around that, but generally 2022 we should be done.
Excellent. All right. Well, now we get to the most juicy part of the interview, and that's the pricing of EV networks. I was a promoter of the Coocham Creek site, obviously doing a lot of EV promotion, so I did make it known what my opinions were to you pretty much early on. Did a lot of modelling because some of my videos were on the charge curves of EVs on the 350, because it was actually amazing to have the ChargeFox 350 at Toombul. I just think that's 350 chargers are very underrated, or underappreciated is probably a better word, for the technology that they are, that we have access to. So that was maybe one of the lines I was heading down with some of my YouTube videos, but that then lent on to the fact that I could perhaps look at how the pricing models could work. So I think a lot of people might be interested in hearing about how you came to your 35 cents and 25 cents per minute charging pricing, because there has been quite a lot of negative feedback about people that are maybe early adopters, Leaps, IMEVs. You're an IMEV owner, so you're well aware of that, but the fact that, even in the Kona, the i3, you pay us quite a significant cost because of the price per minute. But I mean, I know the answer because we've had many conversations, but do you want to take this opportunity to maybe explain to those watching in the audience why the pricing is what the pricing is?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not here to advocate or defend for any particular pricing strategy, because there are many different versions around the world, and we may change over time as well. So what I will do is tell everyone why it is the way it is at the moment, sort of from the ground up. So I think one of the main points of feedback we get from people generally is, I can buy power at home for 20 cents a kilowatt hour, so why are you charging me more? That's like a very common question. And I think the simple truth that maybe isn't well appreciated is that as a commercial customer on the power grid, the way we pay for power is fundamentally different to the way householders pay for power. You know, you might buy your power for 20 or 25 cents, 30 cents if you know, with a dodgy retailer. You might pay $1 a day to be connected, but that's it. It's pretty predictable and it's pretty straightforward. Once you become a larger commercial customer, all bets are off. Your wholesale power is negotiated separately from your retail power, and then you have direct charges from the distribution network as well levied on your bill. And in particular, this really nasty thing they call demand charges. It's got nothing to do with how much energy you sell, it's all about what's your peak load on the network. And those costs can be really steep. And residential customers generally don't pay them, but commercial customers do. So, you know, that's understood if you're in the sector. But then the thing about public charging sites that isn't well understood is that the utilisation levels are really, really low compared to traditional commercial electricity customers. So while those electricity customers might have expensive demand charges, they will tend to be consuming a lot of energy. So think of like a Woolly shopping centre, they're consuming a lot of energy, and so those demand charges get spread out over a lot of kilowatt hours and it doesn't bother them so much. But for us, because we actually don't sell a large number of kilowatt hours, those demand charges really add up. So I'll talk about the pricing in a moment, but I just need to make it clear that in the near term, we as a business, we are typically buying power at a total rolled up cost. We are buying power often at $1 a kilowatt hour or more today, right? So, and this is a product of the way the tariffs work and the fact that the utilisation is really low. So we are taking quite a big loss at the moment, knowing that in future things will improve and the business will become sustainable. So it's not that we're trying to gouge anybody, we're actually trying to strike a balance between what the costs are today and the price we'd like to set. So with that being said, I'll talk a little bit about the way the pricing structure works. And the way we did that is we looked to the future. We said, all right, we've got this site, it's got 6 350 kilowatt chargers installed in it. At some point in the future, there's going to be enough EVs to utilise that site well. So at that time, what are our costs going to be? And so I'll give you a very grossly oversimplified answer, but it will help prove the point. The profitable price is somewhere around 60 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the price that would allow the business to be sustained and to allow all charging networks like us to continue to grow and build more sites. So 60 cents a kilowatt hour, just take that as gospel. At that future point, when we've got lots of customers, the power costs come down. We'll probably be able to get those power costs, still including demand charges and the like, probably back down to around 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So roughly half of that 60 cents is the actual power costs themselves. So what's the other cost for? So the other cost is for building the site, maintaining the site, employing me, and all these other things. And so when every single site costs $1 million to build, give or take, you've got to recoup that. Like the investors are expecting to get that money back at some point. And the way that works, that return of investment, it doesn't matter whether the site gets used or not, because the site's there, and every minute or every hour that the site's there, and every minute or every hour that $1 million is invested in the ground, it's costing the investor money. So that's why there's a time component. It's because irrespective of how much energy you use or how much you sell through the site, somebody has spent all that money developing that site, and over the life of the site, over time, they need to see that money come back. And a per minute rate is a simple way to do it. And what I wanted to quickly illustrate though is how pricing might change. So we have 35 for the energy at the moment and 25 per minute for the time. If you're charging at 60 kilowatts, coincidentally, those two things add up to 60 cents a kilowatt hour. Just happens to work out nicely. So some people will be saying, all right, well, if you can charge 60 cents a kilowatt hour today, what's the problem? You know, if you're saying you need 60 in future and you're getting 60 today, why don't you just charge 60? The problem is that the 60 cents in the future that is viable assumes that people are charging at a much faster rate than they are today, and that the site is churning through a lot more energy than they are today. And the challenge we have is that customers that are today driving cars that charge slowly, in many cases slower than 60, many cars charging at 30 or 20 kilowatts, we will never be able to run a profitable business serving those slow cars with 350 kilowatt chargers. So the pricing structure is deliberately designed for the customer that in future we expect to have and the customer that we want to have, and that's customers that can charge faster. And we're trying to sort of establish that understanding in the market today, because while the sites aren't congested now, it won't be long before our sites start to get congested, and we have to manage congestion, and then people will see why we would rather have, you know, a Tesla Model 3 charging than a Gen 1 Nissan Leaf, because we can sell enough energy quickly enough to that Model 3 to justify having built this big, expensive, high-powered site in the first place, but we'll never be able to justify in the long run serving those slower cars, and we're trying to sort of create that understanding. And one of my biggest frustrations, if I can say this, is that many of the other networks, they know this, like they know that this is the underlying truth, but they're just kind of ignoring it for now because it's convenient to do so, and you're seeing that in some of the simpler pricing structures that we'll talk about in a moment. But you know, other networks have just got a more...
Francesco?
Testing. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so some of the other prices are still a little bit arbitrary and don't really reflect the underlying cost of doing business. And so I kind of want the room to understand that prices are going to change. Not just for us, but for all the others. The prices are going to change, and the likelihood is that they're probably going to go up rather than down.
Of course.
And we're trying to be open about that from day one, even though the cars haven't caught up yet, and even though there's not enough cars to really congest the sites. We're just trying to create some understanding of what's going to happen in future when this sector really matures.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point, because it's not immediately obvious. Like when you're just pulling up and having to pay X amount, you don't have the backstory as to, well, the Quesh side is 20 cents a kilowatt hour. Like, you're just comparing the market, aren't you? You're just going, well, I can charge at home for basically free off my solar, or I can pay my electricity retailer rate, or I can go to the Quesh site and pay 20, or I can go to ChargeFox at I believe what you're saying is a subsidised price of 40 cents. Why on earth would I stop at a charger that's going to cost me 40 to 60, even up to $1 a kilowatt hour? But yeah, when you get the backstory, it is very helpful. And I think it's worth pointing out as well that at the moment, there's probably a lot of local users that are using the sites rather than the way they're intended to be used in the future, which is like long journey pit stops, essentially. So we don't have the volume of EVs doing the intended purpose for the chargers at the moment. So obviously get that bit of backlash because people don't understand, you know, how the pricing structure is. But I guess it had to happen at some point that the pricing that needs to be realised is realised, and I have no doubt you're correct that one of the Clive that's involved with the AEVA down in Tasmania, he has a charging company as well, and they're doing
25 and 25.
Same
as New Zealand.
So something very similar anyway. So you know, like that's probably what we're going to have in the future. So perhaps you did offer, just while we're on the pricing, you did offer some like the early people that signed up to EVIE, you did offer them some packages.
Yep.
Will you be offering more of those type of packages in the future?
Yep.
Got anything to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the current pricing structure is strictly for casual users, right? At the moment, people opportunistically come and stop at the site, they pay that rate. It's definitely not the only way we will be packaging this service for the market. There's all different types of users, right? There's fleets, there's regular commuters, there's weekend travellers. Like, everybody sees a different amount of value in these really high power charging networks. So one of the things we're experimenting with right now is bundles. A bit like, think about the way mobile phones work with pricing. Some of those bundles where you can sort of pay a fixed fee and, all you can eat under that price cap. That's one of the things we're thinking of doing. And the nice thing about that is gives us more predictability on the revenue that we're going to get, so we can in return offer the customers a better deal. So the packages we're trialling at the moment with some of these early customers who we've cherry picked because they're friendly and want to collaborate with us, they are predominantly energy only packages. So prices per kilowatt hour, a capped amount, you pay, you know what you're going to get up front, you pay by the month. That can be very attractive for people who may drive a car that charges slower, but they're going to use the site a lot. It sort of works, it's a win-win for everybody. So yeah, we're going to be experimenting with price a lot because we want to try and drive down to that sweet spot as quick as we can, rather than, just, I guess, running at an arbitrary subsidised price like many of the others, because it's just not creating the right expectations in the marketplace.
Okay. All right, well, thank you. We're up to our last question, which might be keep some people happy. Now, I want to ask this question, then we'll open up for any questions, okay? We discussed your past and like where you came to and where EV's at the moment. What do you see the network or what EV, what's the situation going to be for electric vehicles in Australia, say in 2025, in 5 years' time?
Look, I have to say at the current rates, it's probably not going to be drastically different to today. Unfortunately, we do need something to change. If I had a coffee with Mark and Nathan, I'd be asking them what their ideas are to sort of break the deadlock. But look, I think things are going to keep improving at a steady pace. What I expect to see by 2025 is a lot more choice in the market, and I think that choice reigns supreme, right? You've got to give people all the options. If they want an expensive EV with a high range, great, let them buy it. If they want an inexpensive EV with a short range, let them buy it. My favourite EV right now, if I could have it, would be a $40,000 EV with 200 kilometres of real world range. I would buy that without hesitating right now if I could get it, but I can't. Maybe on the used car market I can, but not new, right? So we need way more choice, and we know that choice exists overseas. It's just that they're not coming to Australia. The other thing we need is to allow other users to drive electric. So at the moment we're all passionate private motorists, but some of us may know corporate fleets that are thinking about going electric and haven't really taken the plunge yet. That's going to be probably the next big wave of adoption, I would think, because the prices are coming down and the infrastructure is coming up. And then there's going to be really high utilisation fleets in particular, like ride-sharing fleets or like commercial vehicles that will become very attractive if the right product comes to market. So I think that'll be the second thing that's going to happen. But longer term, I think there's some pretty exciting trends. There's this guy named Tony Seba that some of you may have seen YouTube videos. So he talks about low cost renewable technology, electrification of vehicles, autonomous vehicles, and shared assets. Those four things coming together, and I do tend to agree with that. So I think the idea of private electric car ownership charged in your garage at your detached house is present today, but in future I think we're going to see a whole new world. We're going to see a lot more shared assets, autonomy's coming, and EVs will be caught up in that trend. It will be a different paradigm in the next 5 to 10 years, that's for sure.
Excellent. Tony Seager's video on disruption is one of the reasons why I got into electric vehicles, actually. So very much well worth checking that out on YouTube. I'm going to walk around with this mic for questions. Does anyone want to ask Andrew a question? Yeah.
Andrew, I'd like to make a point at the start. I think Australia was going to be, you know, taken into the EV market, kicking and screaming because we've got so many petrol heads in that community. And one morning they're going to wake up and they're going to purchase their new car, and you're going to say, well, I want an internal combustion engine. Well, they don't make them overseas anymore. This is all we can buy. You know, we don't make our own cars here in Australia, and because we're just the minnows, and we're dictated to by the overseas market. You know, you've got to look at what's being made in China today. They can't, the new car manufacturer is not allowed to build a nice car, they've got to build an EV.
Yep.
VW has just converted one of the largest factories to the ID3 and ID4. So people that think that it's not coming, they've got a box in their heads. Now the question I want to ask you is the position of these chargers are in Commuter Creek, and nice facility, lovely. The only trouble is we're stuck down the back like we're lepers. You know, I would expect to see the chargers go in and be like a regular service station. I know there must be limitations there, having high voltage next to gasoline, etc., but surely they could have the stations up front so that people can see, hey, these guys are electric cars, they just plug in and walk inside. They don't see that because we're stuck way down the back.
Yep.
And the same when you go to shopping centres where they've got EVs, you know, charging facilities out around the corner somewhere. It's like, hey, I wish to get these people around here.
So can we see the EV networks in a more prominent location?
Yeah, so I don't know if the people online heard the question. The question is, why aren't the charging sites like Commuter Creek way more prominent and in the, I guess, the prime real estate at a site? So there's a couple of reasons for that. You touched on one of them. So there are genuine safety restrictions and Australian standards that mean we cannot put the chargers near the fuel. And not only can they not be near the bowsers, but they can't be near the tanks, they can't be near the vents. So when you look around a servo and the adjoining fast food outlets, you'll be surprised how much fuel infrastructure is scattered around the place that sort of limits our options. So that's one reason. So when we find a site to host us, and I stress the word host, we have to navigate around the other infrastructure that's already there, and that often constrains us. But the other thing is, unfortunately, I've got to say, it's money, right? I said we were going to build 42 sites for $50 million. If you would like them to be bigger, shinier, more prominent sites, we'll make that $100 million. Unfortunately, the Australian industry is not quite yet at the point where anybody can justify acquiring the gold real estate to put charges in. That time will come. We will absolutely do it when we think the time is right. But we're not quite there yet in Australia, but we are seeing signs of that overseas. We're starting to see much more prominent, much more ground-up design charging stations overseas where the market's a bit mature. We will inevitably go there, but it's early days here.
Thank you. Just have a question from the stream. Do you think that the fuel excise will remain in Australia? You know, I know you're not a politician, so
whatever you like. Unfortunately, I think there will be some type of excise equivalent applied to electric vehicles at some point. So that's going to happen. When it happens, I don't know. How much it will be, I don't know. What I'd rather focus the debate on is if EVs are contributing to use of the roads and other government costs, what can we balance those against? You know, Mark and Nathan earlier talked about the environmental benefits. Now, in the State of the EVs report that's just been released, there's actually a whole chapter dedicated to this about what's the net benefit of electric vehicles to society, and EVIE Council's got some quite good research on that. So when you look at the value of avoided oil imports, avoided air pollution, and other societal or environmental benefits, you can start to see, well, okay, sure, we've got to pay for use of the roads, we've got to pay for use of that shared infrastructure, but look at all this money we will save as a country. And I think the challenge for government is to make sure that they balance both sides of that ledger when they consider restructuring vehicle taxation. Because it's going to happen, but it can be done in a constructive way or an unhelpful way. I hope we take a constructive approach like other markets are starting to, like New Zealand, for example.
I've said it before, and I think it's going to be quite difficult for them to remove the fuel excise in place of something else that I just don't see it really being palatable from a political point of view. So, someone else have a question over here? You both want to take something?
Are there any plans for off-the-grid charging stations with the increasing efficiency of photovoltaic cells, reduced costs, the Tesla Powerwall, battery storage coming? What about being off-the-grid? They're not going to pay the grid system $1 kilowatt hour.
Good question, and the related question is, even if we are on the grid, why not put batteries and solar in and the like as well? So I think the way I would answer it is to say, if we do off-grid stations in Australia, they probably won't be 350 kilowatt chargers. They'll be lower power. There's definitely a need and a clear business opportunity today to do off-grid 50 kilowatt charging stations on routes like the Nullarbor, where it's hard to justify anything else. But for our 350 kilowatt network, we need a grid. It's vital. There's no easy way to provide that amount of power without the grid there. Now you've got to work with the grid. Like you've got to complement the grid and connect at the right places and not exacerbate any underlying problems. That's really important, and that's fundamental to the way we select sites. We select sites where it's good to connect, but delivering that amount of power with a battery and a solar panel, well, geez, make that $100 million, $500 million now if you want to do it that way.
All right, guys, you've all been very patient. I'll just do a couple more questions and then wrap things up.
So, two things. First, I'd say I commend you for being so transparent and clear about the charging and the tariff structure that you've got on your charges. Related to that, I guess I'd ask the question that one of the many benefits that EVs are being sold on is the low costs of energy, so fuel equivalent. What do you see? What's the risk of that benefit being misrepresented? Because at the moment we've got the EV Council out there saying charging costs are 1/5 of petrol equivalent vehicles. At the rates that you're talking about, we're talking about ICE equivalent energy costs. What's the risk that the charging industry or the EV industry more broadly ends up being seen as electricity retailers currently are, where people just feel like they're being sold up ultimately when rates go up and up and up?
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly a question that we're facing head on. I think the way to answer it is to look at the spectrum of charging options that are available in the market, and that's one of the best things about electric vehicles. I talked about choice before. One of the very best things about EVs is you get a choice for how you charge the car. You want to charge fast, you can do that. You want to charge slow, you can do that. You want to use green power, you can do that. You want to use coal power, you can do that, or nuclear even if you live overseas, right? So any option is available to you, and they come with a spectrum of costs. So charging at home on your excess solar like John does is basically almost free, effectively free. But if you want to charge your EV at a rate that's similar to filling up a petrol vehicle, it's probably going to cost an amount that's similar to filling up an electric vehicle. And what we're finding is that customers on the average will use the least expensive options most of the time, and then occasionally use the more expensive one. I mean, that's what I do. I drive a Mitsubishi EVIE. When I use Commuter Creek, it costs me quite a lot, but I only do that, every second weekend at most. My predominant charging is at home. It's very inexpensive. I use Quesh quite often. That's relatively inexpensive, and in balance, Commuter Creek has an absolute role for me to get to Noosa whenever I want to. but I don't do it every day. So I think, Mark, the future is still very bright for EVs, but we do need to make sure that we're creating some balance in the charging market so that all those options are available and the right choices are enabled and the right amounts of money are being allocated to that diversity of options as well.
Just to answer a little bit on that as well, like there's a convenience factor for having a charger installed where it is as well. And I hope I do this analogy well, but essentially if you think like at home you can just have a glass of water anytime you want, right? But on the ultra high end of that is you go to a vending machine when you want a glass of water and you're paying like through the nose for it. So there's a convenience factor for charging as well, and that's more about what the high-powered networks are about. If I want to drive to Sydney and I want to get there quickly and conveniently, I can go, stop. You know, I'm getting there as fast as my EV can charge, and it's convenient. If I'm not that concerned, then I can stay overnight halfway and then just go at my own pace, or you know. So there's a convenience factor built into that as well. Maybe just the last question, Graham.
Okay. I'm just putting this out there. I just wonder if there's any benefit of having a big battery at these sites and trickle feed that, and that can discharge at a higher rate. So therefore that gets rid of all that demand charge problem you might have. Is that something you might consider?
Sure.
No doubt.
That's something that we are considering, and we're certainly not alone in that. ChargeFox have deployed 2 batteries in their network of 22 sites. Tesla have done a couple overseas. They may do a couple in Australia as well. So we're absolutely looking at it. What I would say, kind of as I alluded to before, providing those levels of peak power from a battery is a very expensive way to do it. Like multi-million dollars per site if you do it that way. And yeah, you're going to save money on your demand charges over time, but in our evaluation right now, you're not going to save enough for it to be the standard solution. Now, over time, as batteries get better, and they will keep getting better, then that will probably become a predominant solution at some point in the future, but we're not quite there yet. Yeah, the costs are still a little bit too high.
Okay, well, thank you for all being very patient. That brings us to the end of our meeting. Thank you very much to our speakers and Andrew. That was very informative. I think that was great. So, round of applause for Andrew and